welcome back to Marple Mysteries. And if you're new here, you've chosen a very good story to start with. In Netleycroft, Hampshire, they said that Cecily Pargeter had the softest heart in the village and that Olive Swan had the steadiest hands. And both of those things were true. And neither of them told you anything useful about what had actually happened on the Tuesday morning in September when Cecily's heart stopped and Olive's hands were right there beside her. The inquest lasted 40 minutes. The death certificate said cardiac failure. The village grieved with the quiet efficiency of a community that has done this before and knows which casseroles freeze well. And then a small white-haired lady stepped off the 11:15 from Winchester, uninvited by the police, unannounced to the killer, and absolutely certain that something in Netleycroft was not what it appeared to be. Before we begin, drop a comment and tell us where you're watching from today. We have viewers joining from all over the world, and we love knowing who's settling in for this one. Because this story is going to ask something of you. It's going to ask you to look past the sweetest woman in the village and find what's underneath. If you're ready, let's go to Netleycroft, Chapter 1. The 11:15 from Winchester. The train arrived 4 minutes late, which Netleycroft's single platform received with the stoic indifference of a place that has never expected punctuality from the outside world and has not been disappointed. Miss Jane Marple descended from the second carriage with a carpet bag, a smaller bag of a greenish tweed that had seen decades, and the particular quality of attention she brought, not to every new place. Not curiosity exactly, because curiosity implies uncertainty, and Marple was rarely uncertain for long. It was more the quality of a naturalist arriving at a known habitat. Here are the chalk hills, here is the smell of the stream and the wood smoke, here is the woman on the platform who has been waiting for 11 minutes and is managing her impatience by pretending to examine the timetable she has certainly memorized. Jane! Dorothea Fenn opened her arms and Marple walked into them with the ease of 60 years of friendship, the kind that requires no maintenance because it was built on something sturdier than proximity. Thea! Marples stepped back and looked at her. You've lost weight since Easter. I've been worried. Dorothea said it plainly, because she had always been a plain speaker. It was what had made her an excellent schoolmistress and occasionally an uncomfortable friend. She was 71, upright, with white hair cut short, and the hands of a woman who had spent 40 years writing on blackboards. I'm glad you came. You said you were troubled by something you couldn't name. Marple picked up her smaller bag before Dorothea could reach for it. In 30 years of correspondence, I don't think you've ever used those words. You name things very precisely as a rule. Dorothea smiled, but it didn't reach the usual depth. Yes. Well, that's rather the problem. They walked out of the station into the September afternoon. The high street of Netleycroft presented itself with the self-possession of a village that knows it is picturesque and has decided not to be embarrassed about it. The chalk stream ran along the eastern edge of the street, behind a low stone wall, clear and low in the late summer drought, catching what remained of the afternoon light. There were 8 shops, a Norman church with a yew in the yard that was older than the church, a pub called the Netlicroft Arms, whose sign depicted an arm in a coat of medieval armour holding what might have been a mace, or might have been a large loaf of bread. The paint had achieved a productive ambiguity over the centuries. The pavement was uneven in the way of places where the ground beneath has its own opinions. Pots of late-season geraniums stood at intervals, the flowers going over, the leaves still darkly green. Marple noted all of it. She noted the way 3 women outside the post office watched her arrival with the focused attention of people who already know who you are and where you've come from, and are simply confirming the details. She noted a curtain on the first floor of the house, adjacent to the church, that moved when it should have been still. She noted a woman at the far end of the street, who turned a corner just a moment after Marple's eyes reached her. A woman of about 60, unhurried, carrying a basket, whose particular quality of not looking back struck Marple as the body language of someone who is aware of being watched and has decided to perform unawareness. "Who lives at the end of the street?" Marple said. "The last house before the turn." Dorothea glanced in that direction. "That would be the Swan Cottage. Olive Swan." A pause. "She was Cecily's closest friend. In the last year or so." "In the last year or so," Marple repeated, with the mild tone she used when filing things away. They walked on. Dorothea's cottage was on the western side of the village, down a lane that smelled of fallen apples and clay, a stone building of no particular period that had arrived at its current state through a process of steady domestic accumulation. A greenhouse added here, a window widened there, a garden that had been planted in a spirit of grand ambition and compromised with cheerful pragmatism. Inside, it smelled of books, and the particular beeswax polish Dorothea had used on her floors since 1974. A kettle was already on. They sat in the kitchen, and Dorothea poured, and for a few minutes they spoke of mutual friends, and the journey and the dryness of the autumn, because there are things that must be said before the important things, and both of them knew it. Then Dorothea set down her cup. "Cecily Pargeter died on the 14th of September, she said, "a Tuesday morning. She was 68. She had a heart condition, had done for years, managed on medication, no particular cause for alarm. She died at home. Olive Swan was with her, or found her, depending on which account you read." "Depending on which account," Marple said. The inquest accepted Olive's account, which was that she arrived at Cecily's at 7:30, found the door unlocked, and discovered Cecily in the sitting-room armchair. The doctor signed the certificate. Cardiac failure. The funeral was on the 21st. Dorothea looked at the table. "It was a very nice service." "But," said Marple. Dorothea was quiet for a moment. In 40 years of friendship, Marple had seen her be quiet rarely, and never without purpose. "But I was awake at 9:30 that night, the night before Cecily died, the Monday. I was awake because the foxes were in the garden again, and I went to the kitchen for a glass of water, and from the kitchen window I can see down the end of the lane where it meets the main street, and I saw Olive Swan coming out of the gate of Cecily's cottage." Dorothea looked up. At 9:30 at night. Walking quickly, not running, but with intention. And Olive told the constable she had left at 7. Olive told the constable she had left at 7 after dropping in some soup. Cecily had seemed tired, she said, and she hadn't wanted to stay too long. Dorothea's hands were still around her cup. I told myself I was mistaken. It was dark. I wasn't wearing my glasses. It might have been anyone. But it wasn't anyone, Marple said. I know her walk. 30 years in the same village. I know her walk the way I know my own name. Dorothea lifted her eyes, and in them Marple saw what the letter had told her. Not grief exactly, but the particular discomfort of a woman who has been carrying a truth sideways, unable to look at it directly. I didn't say anything at the inquest because I told myself. You thought that if you were right, Marple said gently, then a very great deal would have to follow. And you didn't want to be the one to begin it, if there was any chance you were wrong. Dorothea let out a breath that had been a long time coming. Yes, exactly that. Marple nodded slowly. Outside, the garden was taking on the amber quality of a late September afternoon. The apples on the tree near the wall turning golden and beginning to drop. The chalk stream was audible if you listened. A low, constant sound. The sound of water that has been moving through the same valley for longer than anyone can remember and has no particular opinion about any of it. Tell me about Cecily, Marple said. Not the official version. Tell me what she was actually like. Dorothea considered this with the seriousness it deserved. She was genuinely kind, she said at last. I want to be fair to her. Whatever else she was genuinely kind. And that's not nothing. She remembered things about people. Their mother's maiden names, the year they'd had the bad harvest, the grandchild who'd been ill. She used those memories generously. A slight pause. But she was also, I think the word is careful. She was very careful. There was always a sense with Cecily that the generosity was also, in some small way, strategic. Not dishonestly, not consciously, I think, but as though kindness was a thing she had learned was the safest way to move through the world, rather than a thing that came entirely naturally. A woman, Marple said thoughtfully, who had learned at some point that it was important to be liked. Yes, that's it precisely. Dorothea looked at her. You're going to ask me why she needed to be liked? I was, Marple agreed, but we have time. First, tell me about her stepson, Gerald. The kitchen grew a degree or two quieter, as it does when a name introduces a complication. Gerald Pargeter. Dorothea refilled both cups. He's 44. A solicitor in Winchester. Came once a month, very regular as clockwork. He and Cecily were not warm. There was some business about Edmund's will. Gerald's father. That Gerald felt had not been handled entirely to his understanding. He'd been expecting something, I think, that turned out to be differently arranged than he'd expected. He was in the village the week before Cecily died. He and Cecily had an argument in the garden. 2 people heard the tone, if not the words. And the village has decided, Marple said. The village has decided, Dorothea confirmed without satisfaction. Stanley Quirk at the pub has decided. PC Nunn is writing notes in a direction that suggests he has decided. And there's an inspector being sent from Winchester, apparently, to look at the whole thing again. Because Dr. Hargreaves, the locum who signed the certificate. It turns out he has a somewhat complicated professional history, and someone has raised a question about whether he looked closely enough. Did he? Dorothea was quiet again, and this time the quality of the quiet was different, more careful. That, she said, is what I cannot name. Not the fact of it, the shape of it. Something is wrong, Jane. I can feel that something is wrong, and I cannot tell you what or where or how, only that I saw Olive Swan coming out of that gate at 9:30, and her brother died in a bedsit in Swindon 3 years ago, and Cecily's maiden name was Holt. Marple set down her cup very slowly. Say that again. Her maiden name was Holt. Dorothea's voice was even, careful. Before she married Edmund, she was Cecily Holt, from Gloucestershire originally. She watched Marple's face. You know something? No, Marple said, and she said it honestly. Not yet. But I think I'm beginning to know the shape of something. She looked out at the garden, at the apple tree, and the long light. Olive's brother's name? Thomas, Dorothea said. Thomas Renwick. The kitchen was very quiet. The stream ran on outside, indifferent, continuous, carrying whatever the hills gave it down through the valley toward the sea. I think, Marple said at last, that I should like to walk through the village before supper, if you don't mind. Simply to get the feel of the place. Of course. Dorothea rose. Jane? Yes. I'm glad you came, Dorothea said again, but this time it meant something different than it had on the platform. It meant I was afraid, and now I am a little less afraid, and I don't entirely know why, but I trust it. Marple patted her hand. Put something on for supper, she said. And Thea, tell me, is Olive Swan's cottage visible from any point on the high street? Dorothea thought. From the churchyard wall, if you stood at the east end. Good, said Marple, and put on her coat. Outside, the September afternoon was cooling rapidly toward evening. The first bonfire smell of the autumn was on the air. Someone, somewhere at the edge of the village, burning the last of the garden waste. Marple walked slowly. The carpet-bag left behind, only her cardigan and the small sharp engine of her attention. She walked the length of the high street, nodding to the women outside the post office, who nodded back with the mixture of friendliness and assessment that small villages extend to newcomers. She looked in at the window of the Nettlecroft Arms, where Stanley Quirk was writing something in a ledger, and a man she did not know sat at the bar with the expression of a person who is not quite drinking, but is not quite not drinking. She went to the churchyard. The yew was very old. She put it at 600 years, give or take, which meant it had been standing when the village was in an entirely different century, and had not yet invented any of its current problems. She stood at the east wall as Dorothea had directed, and from there she could see the end of the high street, and at its end the Swan cottage. Stone, well kept, a late rose still in flower at the gate, a light burning in the front room against the coming dark. The curtain moved. Marple did not look away. After a moment, the curtain settled, and she had the distinct impression of a woman on the other side of it who had looked back at her and decided calmly that there was nothing to be concerned about. Marple stood a moment longer. Then she turned and walked back toward Dorothea's cottage through the falling dark, and behind her the bonfire smell thickened on the air, and the chalk stream ran on, and somewhere above the village the first stars of the autumn evening were coming through. She was already counting the visits. She just didn't know it yet. The Women's Institute Autumn Sale opened at 10 o'clock on Thursday morning in the village hall, which smelled of the decades. Floor polish, old timber, and the particular ghost of every harvest supper and wedding reception and awkward AGM that had ever taken place within its walls. Dorothea had suggested Marple attend with the breezy confidence of a woman who knows that a village sale is the finest intelligence-gathering operation available to the amateur investigator, though she did not phrase it in quite those terms. She said, "Everyone goes, you'll meet everyone, and Olive always has a table." Marple arrived at 10:10, which was late enough to enter an already humming room without attracting the attention that comes with being first, and early enough to observe the social architecture before it shifted into the comfortable chaos of the middle hour. The hall was arranged with the reliable geometry of these occasions. Baked goods along the left wall, preserves and pickles at the far end, a bring-and-buy table of magnificent disorder near the door, handicrafts along the right, a tea-urn of considerable age and authority-held position at the centre. Women of various vintages moved between tables with the focused pleasure of people engaged in something that matters in precisely the scale it is meant to matter. Not grandly, not trivially, but in the middle register of community life where most of the actual living gets done. Olive Swan's table was the baked goods. Marple took her in properly for the first time. 64, of medium height, with the kind of face that invites confidence. Not beautiful, but reassuring, with grey eyes that were attentive without being searching and hands that confirmed what Dorothea had said. Steady, capable, the hands of someone accustomed to being useful in difficult moments. She wore a blue cardigan and her hair was neatly set. She was talking to a woman of about 40, with the ease of someone who is entirely comfortable in every room she enters, because she has decided, long ago, to be comfortable, and has never found reason to revise that decision. On the table before her, 3 Victoria sponges, a lemon drizzle, 2 dozen shortbread, and a fruitcake that had the dark, serious authority of something that had been feeding for weeks. Marple bought a jar of plum jam from the preserves table, admired a hand-knitted item of uncertain function at the handicrafts table, and arrived at the baked goods with the expression of mild, appreciative interest she deployed in these situations. "What a beautiful sponge," she said. Olive looked up and smiled. It was a good smile, warm, present, the smile of a woman who has given a great deal of herself to a great many people and has not yet run out. "Are you visiting?" "I don't think we've met." "Jane Marple. I'm staying with Dorothea Fenn for a week or so. Old friends. Of course, Dorothea mentioned you might be coming." Something passed through Olive's eyes. Not alarm, not quite. A calibration. She said you were from St. Mary Mead. All my life, Marple agreed pleasantly. You're Mrs. Swan. Dorothea speaks very warmly of you. Olive, please. She cut a slice of the sponge and transferred it to a paper plate with the efficiency of long practice. Try this. It was Cecily's favourite. She said it naturally, the way you mention the dead when they are freshly gone and present in everything. And Marple received it naturally, accepting the plate with a murmur of thanks. I was so sorry to hear about Mrs. Pargeter, Marple said. A shock, I imagine, even when health has been a concern. It was. Olive straightened a doily that didn't need straightening. She'd been tired the last few months. I kept telling her to rest more. She never listened. A small, fond smile. She was stubborn about her independence. Wouldn't hear of any fuss. The best ones never do, Marple said, and moved on. She found Stanley Quirk at the bring and buy table, which he was examining with the expression of a man who has not come to buy anything but cannot resist looking. He was 59, broad-shouldered, with a former soldier's posture and a landlord's easy manner. The kind of man who forgets nothing that's said at his bar and has the social intelligence to pretend otherwise. He introduced himself before she could ask. Stanley Quirk. You'll be Miss Marple, Dorothea's friend. He shook her hand with a firmness that stopped just short of becoming a statement. Settling in all right? Beautifully, Marple said. It's a lovely village, though I understand you've had a sad time of it recently. Quirker's expression settled into something more considered. Cecily Pargeter. Yes. He picked up a brass candlestick from the table, examined it, set it down. Terrible business. She was well liked. I gather there's been some suggestion that her death wasn't entirely straightforward. Quirk looked at her with the sharp appraisal of a man reassessing what he's dealing with. Then he seemed to decide something. There's an inspector coming from Winchester, he said, keeping his voice low. Word got round. And I'll tell you what I told PC Nunn. If you're looking at who had reason, you don't have to look past that stepson. Gerald Pargeter. He was in that garden shouting, well, raised voices, 3 days before she died. Quirk set down another object. And he stands to benefit, doesn't he? Estate, the cottage. That's always the place to begin. It usually is, Marple agreed, with the mild tone that meant she was noting something and not saying so. She was still noting it 20 minutes later when Gerald Pargeter himself arrived. He came through the door with the look of a man attending an obligation. Not unwillingly, precisely, but without the ease of someone who belongs. He was 44, lean, with the slightly overworked appearance of a professional who sleeps less than he should and compensates with good shoes. His face was not unkind. It was the face of a man managing several things simultaneously and not enjoying any of them. He saw Olive first. Something moved between them across the room. Not hostility, not warmth. Recognition of the careful kind. Then his eyes found Marple, and she gave him her best expression of benign vacancy, and he looked away. He did not, she noted, look like a murderer. But then, in her experience, they very rarely did. The invitation came through Dorothea, as most things in Nettlecroft did. Olive Swan had left a note, handwritten, on cream paper, in the upright, careful script of someone who learned penmanship when it was still considered a moral quality, inviting Dorothea and her guest for tea on Friday afternoon. Dorothea read it at breakfast and passed it across the table without comment, which was itself a comment. Marple accepted with pleasure. Olive's cottage was the kind of interior that tells you a great deal about its occupant if you know how to read it. Not because anything is displayed carelessly, but because the care itself is informative. Everything was clean, considered, and precisely useful. There were no ornaments that didn't earn their place. The bookshelves held nursing references, local history, 3 volumes of the same hymnal in descending condition, and a row of Agatha Christie novels which Marple observed with the private amusement she generally kept to herself. The kitchen smelled of something baking. The sitting-room fire had been lit against the afternoon chill and was doing its job without drama. "What a comfortable room," Marple said, and meant it as a question. "I've been here 26 years, Olive said, setting down the tea tray. "Long enough to get it right." 26 years. 2 years after Cecily arrived. Marple filed it and looked around the room with the pleasant, unfocused expression she had perfected over decades. The expression that allowed her to look at everything without appearing to look at anything. The photograph was on the mantelpiece, between a small carriage clock and a pottery vase of dried lavender. A young man, perhaps 25, standing outside a half-built structure, the skeleton of a house, timber framing against a pale sky. He was smiling at whoever held the camera with the unguarded confidence of someone who has not yet learned to be careful. The photograph was slightly faded at the edges, the way photographs from the late 1970s fade. Not with the crisp nostalgia of black and white, but with the particular melancholy of colour that has been losing its argument with time. Marple looked at it for 2 seconds. Then she looked at the fire. Tea was poured. They talked about the village, about the Dubby-Wubby-Eye sale, about the dryness of the autumn, and what it would mean for the gardens. Olive was an excellent conversationalist in the way of someone who has learned that the best way to remain unexamined is to be genuinely interested in others. She asked Marple about St. Mary Mead with what appeared to be authentic curiosity. She refilled cups without being asked. Her hands, pouring, were perfectly steady. "You must miss Mrs. Pargeter terribly," Marple said, in the gap between one subject and the next. "Every day," Olive said. Simply, without performance. She was. We understood each other. That's rarer than people think at our age. Finding someone you don't have to explain yourself to. Had you known each other long? We became close in the last year or so. Before that we were friendly, neighbourly. But last year, yes, we spent a great deal of time together. She looked at the fire. I'm glad of that now, that we had that time. Marple nodded gently. Who is the young man? She said, with the idle curiosity of someone making conversation, gesturing toward the mantelpiece. A pause. Brief. A beat, perhaps 2. But Marple had been watching for it. My brother, Olive said. Thomas. That was taken in 1977. He wanted to be an architect. She smiled, and the smile was real, which made it harder to look at, not easier. He had a gift for it. Does he still practice? He died, Olive said, 3 years ago. And then, smoothly, without a tremor, more tea, Miss Marple? Rowena Chalk was 38 and occupied the small public library with the quiet authority of someone who has made a considered choice about where they belong and is not interested in revisiting it. She was angular, self-contained, with ink on her right index finger, and the expression of a person who finds most social situations mildly less interesting than whatever she was reading before they interrupted. She thawed slightly when Marple asked about the history of Nettlecroft's water mills. You actually want to know, Rowena said, with the faint suspicion of someone accustomed to polite questions that don't require actual answers. I wouldn't have asked otherwise, Marple said pleasantly. That was apparently the correct response. Rowena produced 2 local history pamphlets, a hand-drawn map of the Chalk Stream from 1834, and an opinion about the county archives cataloguing system that Marple listened to with genuine interest. They sat at the reading table, and within 20 minutes Rowena had relaxed into the focused, unguarded manner of someone talking about something they actually love. Cecily Pargeter started me on this, Rowena said, spreading the map between them. She wanted a proper history of the Pargeter family's connection to the mills. Edmund's grandfather built the second one in 1887. She was very particular that it should be accurate. A history of the family, Marple said. That must have required a good deal of research. Parish records, mostly. Land registry. Some private papers Edmund had kept. Rowena's finger traced the stream on the map. I found all sorts of things that weren't directly relevant. Old civil matters. Property disputes. She paused, almost imperceptibly. The kind of thing that was important once and isn't now. Family histories do accumulate those, Marple agreed. Cecily's asked me to leave certain things out, Rowena said quietly, not looking up from the map. I didn't ask why. It seemed it was her family. Her decision. Of course, Marple said, and did not press, because pressing was not always the most efficient method. She walked back to Dorothea's through the early evening, the bonfire smell again on the air, the stream audible beyond the wall. She was thinking about a young man standing outside an unfinished house, smiling at someone holding a camera, not yet knowing what was coming. She was thinking about a woman who had poured tea with perfectly steady hands and said the word brother without a tremor. She was thinking that grief of 26 years does not tremble. It has learned, long since, to the surgery occupied a converted Victorian house at the north end of the village, set back from the road behind a privet hedge that had been allowed to grow with more enthusiasm than direction. A brass plate beside the door read Dr. R. Hargreaves, MBBs, the locum's name added beneath the regular GPs in the temporary way of things expected to be temporary. Marple arrived at 9:30 before the morning appointments filled the waiting room, and asked the receptionist. Mrs. Gedge, 50s, the kind of efficient who knows everything and volunteers nothing. whether Dr. Hargreaves might spare her 10 minutes on a personal matter. He could spare her 15, it turned out. The morning was light. Dr. Hargreaves was 52 and looked it in the specific way of a man who had been, at 40, rather good-looking, and had since allowed that fact to become historical. He had the slightly defended manner of someone who has been asked to explain himself before and has constructed, through repetition, a perfectly adequate explanation that nonetheless satisfies no one entirely, including himself. He was not unkind. He was tired in a way that suggested the tiredness was not recent. "Miss Marple," he said, with the carefully neutral tone of a professional who has learned not to ask obvious questions. "How can I help?" Marple settled into the chair across from his desk with the unhurried ease of someone who has nowhere more pressing to be. "I'm an old friend of Dorothea Fenn's," she said. "I hope you'll forgive an old woman's curiosity. I've heard a good deal about Mrs. Pargeter since I arrived, and I find myself with questions that nobody seems quite able to answer." Hargreaves studied her for a moment. Then he said, "What sort of questions?" "The quiet sort," Marple said pleasantly. "I understand you attended Mrs. Pargeter in her last months?" "Twice," he said. "Her regular GP, Dr. Marsh, is on extended medical leave. I've been covering since April." He paused. "I examined Mrs. Pargeter in June and again in August. She presented with fatigue and some increased cardiac irregularity consistent with her existing arrhythmia. I adjusted her monitoring schedule and advised rest." "And the death certificate, cardiac failure." "Which is what it was." His voice was even, but something behind it had shifted, the way a floor shifts almost imperceptibly under weight. Her heart was compromised. This was documented. It failed. These things happen with arrhythmia. They can happen without warning, without dramatic preceding episodes. "Of course," Marple said. "I wonder. Would you mind, for my own understanding, looking at her file again? I find I'm better with specifics than with generalities at my age." He minded, she could see that. But he was also a man who had something to prove to himself about thoroughness, and she had correctly judged that the way to reach him was through his professional conscience rather than around it. He opened the file. They sat in silence while he read. Marple waited with the patience of someone accustomed to waiting. Then he stopped. He went back a page. Read it again. His expression did not change dramatically. It was more like a landscape absorbing weather, the change happening beneath the surface first. "This note," he said slowly. "Yes," said Marple. "It's in the file under August entries. It's a supplementary observation. Fatigue, reduced appetite, some notation about sleep disturbance." He looked up. "I didn't write this." The room was very quiet. Outside, a car passed on the road, and the privet hedge absorbed the sound. "Are you certain?" Marple said. "It's not my handwriting." He turned the file to show her. The note was written in an upright, careful script, precise, unhurried, the hand of someone who had learned penmanship when it was still considered important. And the observations, sleep disturbance specifically. That's not something Mrs. Pargeter mentioned to me. Either appointment. Marple looked at the handwriting for precisely the time it required. Then she looked at the window. Who else would have access to this file? Nobody should. He said it with the flatness of someone confronting a door that should be locked and isn't. The receptionist, technically, for administrative entries. Myself. The practice manager. He paused. And anyone who accompanied a patient as a carer if they were left briefly with the file during a consultation. He looked at her, which happened once in July. Mrs. Pargeter came with. He stopped. Yes, said Marple gently. With her neighbour, he said, Mrs. Swan, who is a retired district nurse, and who waited in this office for approximately 8 minutes while I examined Mrs. Pargeter next door. Marple nodded once, slowly, as though this confirmed something she had merely suspected. In fact, it confirmed something she had known since the mantelpiece. But the manner was important. P.C. Nunn received her at the police house with the conscientious anxiety of a man who knows he is out of his depth and is managing it through paperwork. He was 34, thorough, in the way of someone who trusts procedure, because procedure has never yet let him down, and he had the good sense to offer tea before asking what she wanted. She asked, over the tea, about the prescription. He remembered it immediately, which told her it had been bothering him also, sitting unexamined in the file of things that were probably administrative, and probably nothing. About 4 months before she died, he said. Mrs. Pargeter came in, not here, to the surgery, to report that her repeat prescription hadn't come through. She'd been waiting 10 days. She was out of medication. He turned a page in his notebook. It was eventually traced to a routing issue in the locum prescription system. The request had been redirected to a regional processing centre instead of the local pharmacy. Technical error. Who submitted the repeat request? Nunn looked at his notes. It was called in on Mrs. Pargeter's behalf, he said, by a Mrs. Swan, who said Mrs. Pargeter had asked her to call as she was feeling too tired to manage it herself. The bonfire smell came through the window, faint and sweet and autumnal. And the second time? Marple said. Nunn looked up sharply. There was only. He stopped, went back through his notes with the expression of a man finding a gap he hadn't seen before. I'd need to check, he said quietly. Yes, said Marple. I think you probably would. She walked home through the village with the steady, unhurried pace of someone whose mind is moving considerably faster than her feet. The chalk stream ran beside the wall. The afternoon light was doing its September thing, golden and slightly melancholy, the light of a season finishing its work. She was counting now. She just knew it. The Pargeter cottage had been locked since the funeral and smelled of it. That specific interior stillness of a house whose occupant has left and not been replaced, where the air has stopped moving in the particular way that living people move it. Rowena Chalk had a key, given to her by Cecily months before for the purposes of the family history project, and she used it with the careful reverence of someone aware that the permission was granted by a person no longer able to rescind it. They had agreed to meet at 10. Marple arrived first and stood in the small front garden, looking at the cottage. Late roses at the gate. The same variety as olive swans, she noted, the kind that persists into October with the stubbornness of things that have decided not to acknowledge autumn. The gate latch was worn smooth on the inside from years of the same hand closing it the same way. Rowena arrived with a canvas bag of notebooks and the focused, slightly defensive energy of someone returning to a task that has become complicated. She unlocked the door without ceremony, and they went in. The sitting room had been tidied after the death. Gerald's doing, probably, or a hired firm, but Cecily's presence remained in the arrangement of things, the particular choices of a particular woman over many years. Books on the lower shelves within easy reach. A chair angled toward the window for the afternoon light. A small writing desk in the corner, its surface clear, except for a pottery inkwell that hadn't held ink in years, but had been kept because it was pretty. The papers were in 3 boxes in the second bedroom, stacked with the mild disorder of a project in progress. Rowena had indexed them already. A handwritten list, detailed and precise, the work of someone who finds order genuinely satisfying rather than merely necessary. Parish records. Land registry documents. Edmund Pargeter's personal correspondence, sorted by decade. Several folders of financial records. 2 shoeboxes of photographs. They worked quietly and companionably, the way 2 people work when the task is clear and the conversation can be left to find its own moments. Marple took the legal documents. She had asked for them specifically, with the mild vagueness of someone following no particular instinct, and Rowena had handed them over without question, because Marple had the quality, useful in these situations, of seeming entirely unthreatening while being nothing of the sort. The civil case reference was in the 3rd folder. It was a letter from a solicitor in Cheltenham, dated March 1979, addressed to Edmund Pargeter in his professional capacity and referencing a matter in which he had provided supporting testimony the previous year. The language was the careful, qualified language of legal correspondence. Acknowledgements, confirmations, the particular grammar of things being closed down formally. The case itself was described obliquely in the way of letters that assume the recipient already has the context. The matter of Renwick v. Holt and associated parties, now concluded. Renwick versus Holt. Marple read the line twice. Then she read the surrounding paragraph, which established that the case had concluded in favour of the associated parties, that the Renwick claim had been dismissed, and that the testimony of the witness, designated in proceedings as Miss C. Holt had been in the court's assessment material to that conclusion. Miss C. Holt. Cecily before she was Pargeter. Before she came to Netleycroft. Before she married Edmund. Before she became the woman who remembered everyone's birthdays and whose kindness was genuine and whose generosity was, Dorothea had said, also in some small way strategic. Marple set the letter down with the care of someone handling something that has sharp edges. She looked across the room at Rowena, who was working through the photograph boxes with the focused attention of someone cataloguing rather than reminiscing. "Rowena," she said, "you mentioned that Cecily asked you to leave certain things out of the family history." Rowena didn't look up immediately. When she did, her expression was the careful neutral of someone who has been waiting for a question and has not yet decided how much of the answer to give. Yes, were the things she asked you to leave out connected to a civil case from around 1978? A pause. Rowena set down the photograph she was holding. She didn't tell me the details. She said there was a legal matter involving Edmund's professional capacity that had been resolved long ago and wasn't relevant to the family history. She seemed, Rowena considered the word carefully, relieved when I agreed, as though she'd been carrying the question of whether to ask me for some time. Did you look at the case yourself? I found the letter. I didn't pursue it. Rowena's voice was level, but something beneath it was not. It wasn't my business to pursue it. The name Renwick, Marple said. Did you see it? Rowena looked at her steadily. Yes, she said. Before Marple could continue, the front door opened. Gerald Pargater stood in the doorway in his good shoes and his managed expression, and took in the two women and the open boxes with the rapid assessment of a solicitor reading a room. His eyes went to the folders in Marple's hands and stayed there for a moment too long. "Miss Chalk," he said, "I didn't know you'd be working today." "I told you I'd be continuing the project," Rowena said, with the calm of someone who has already had this argument and won it. "I thought I'd made clear." He stopped, looked at Marple. "I don't think we've been introduced. Jane Marple. I'm staying with Dorothea Fenn." She held the folder with the mild possessiveness of someone who has no intention of putting it down. "I've been helping Rowena with the sorting. Such interesting family history. You must be very proud of the Pargater connection to the mills." Gerald looked at the folder. "I'd like this project paused," he said, "until the estate is settled." "Of course," Marple said pleasantly, "though I imagine the parish records will keep." He left 10 minutes later, having achieved nothing except confirming, for Marple, that he knew enough about the 1978 case to be uncomfortable with the papers being read, but not enough about what had actually happened to Cecily to be anything other than what he appeared to be. A man with a financial problem and a bad conscience about a stepmother he had treated poorly and could no longer apologize to. Not a killer. Just a person who had made the ordinary human error of assuming there would be more time. Rowena watched the door close behind him. "He knows about the case," she said. "He knows something about it." Marple agreed. Whether he knows what it connects to is another question. She set the folder down and looked at Rowena directly. Did Cecily ever mention a woman named Olive Swan in connection with any of this? The quality of Rowena's silence answered before her words did. "No," she said. "Never." And then, quietly, should she have? Outside, the October light was thinning toward noon, and somewhere at the edge of the village, the chalk stream ran on over its white stones, carrying everything the hills gave it, keeping none of it, telling nothing. Inspector Lorimer arrived on a Wednesday morning in a car that was slightly too clean for a village with unpaved lanes. And he brought with him the particular energy of a man who has been given a case he considers straightforward and would like to confirm that assessment and be home by Friday. He was 47, well built, with the kind of face that photographs well at press conferences. Square-jawed, attentive, reassuring in the way of institutions that have learned presentation matters. He was not stupid. Marple identified this immediately and adjusted accordingly, because stupid opponents are actually more dangerous than intelligent ones in certain configurations. And Lorimer was the kind of intelligent that could be managed if you understood which direction it preferred to move. He set up in the back room of the Nettlecroft Arms, which Stanley Quirk offered with the enthusiasm of a man who understands that proximity to a police investigation is excellent for the bar trade. By 11 o'clock, Lorimer had spoken to P.C. Nunn, reviewed the file, and requested interviews with Gerald Pargeter, Dr. Hargreaves, and 3 witnesses who had been near the Pargeter cottage in the days preceding Cecily's death. He spoke to Marple at noon, briefly, in the manner of someone clearing an item from a list. Miss Marple. He shook her hand with the calibrated warmth of a man who respects the elderly in principle and finds them mildly inconvenient in practice. I understand you've been asking some questions around the village. Just an old woman's curiosity, Marple said, with the smile she kept specifically for this purpose. I find that at my age, questions are really the only reliable entertainment left. Lorimer smiled back. It almost reached his eyes. Well, we're very grateful for the community's interest, but I want to reassure you, and Mrs. Fenn, who I understand has been concerned, that we are treating this matter with complete thoroughness. He settled back slightly in his chair, the body language of a man delivering reassurance he has delivered before. I expect to have a clear picture within 48 hours. A clear picture, Marple said. How efficient. We have motive, opportunity, and a pattern of behaviour in the days preceding the death that we're currently examining. He said it with the smooth neutrality of a man who is actually saying something much more specific. I'm not able to share details, but I want you to know the matter is in hand. Marple looked at him with the mild, interested expression of someone following a lecture that is going in the wrong direction, and deciding not to say so yet. That is very reassuring, she said. Tell me, have you been able to look at Gerald Pargeter's movements in the 48 hours before Mrs. Pargeter's death? His professional diary, that sort of thing? A fractional pause. That's an area we're examining, which meant no. Of course, Marple said. And the prescription records, the pharmacy routing, that sort of administrative history. I imagine that's quite a trail to follow. Another pause, slightly longer. Miss Marple. His tone shifted a degree, not unkindly, but with a definiteness. I want to encourage you to enjoy the autumn countryside. Nettlecroft is very beautiful at this time of year, I'm told. It is, Marple agreed warmly. The chalk stream especially. Thank you so much, Inspector. She thanked him with the specific graciousness of a woman who has been told to go away and has decided to take the instruction as a mild suggestion. Dorothea was in the garden when Marple returned, cutting back the last of the summer growth with the decisive movements of someone who finds physical tasks a useful place to put strong feelings. Well, she said, not stopping. "He's building toward Gerald Pargeter," Marple said, sitting on the garden bench, with the ease of someone whose feet have been working since breakfast. Efficiently and incorrectly, he has the motive, the inheritance dispute. He has the witnesses who heard the argument in the garden. He has Dr. Hargreaves's careless certificate, which he's reading as evidence of a death that needed covering rather than a death that was arranged. Dorothea cut a stem with more force than necessary. And Gerald's alibi, not yet examined. He'll get there. He's not careless, exactly. He's just moving in a direction that feels right and hasn't yet encountered sufficient friction to make him reconsider. Marple looked at the apple tree, from which 3 more apples had fallen in the night. He has approximately 48 hours before he does something that will be difficult to undo. Then we have 48 hours. "I have one specific problem," Marple said. "I can see the architecture of what Olive did. The prescription delays. None confirmed a second one this morning, 6 weeks before the death. Same mechanism, same routing. The note in the file in Olive's handwriting. The supplement she recommended, which I've been thinking about since the WI sale." She paused. "The supplement and Cecily's cardiac medication. There's a specific interaction. I need to confirm it with someone who knows pharmacology properly." "I know someone," Dorothea said immediately, with the confidence of a woman who has taught 3 generations of a village and retains the network. "Margaret Holloway, retired hospital pharmacist, 60s, lives in Stockbridge, 20 minutes by car. Can you telephone her this afternoon?" "I can telephone her now." Dorothea set down her shears. "What am I asking?" Marple described the supplement. She had the name from the note in Cecily's drawer, which Rowena had located that morning at Marple's request and read aloud without being told why it mattered. She described Cecily's medication. She described a period of sustained administration over several months. Dorothea listened without expression. Then she said, "Jane, if this is what you think it is." "It is," Marple said quietly. Then she did it without leaving a clear crime. "Almost without leaving a clear crime," Marple said. "There's the note in the file, the prescription records, the timing of the visits against the decline, the supplement note in Rowena's drawer in Olive's hand. None of it is a confession. None of it is a smoking pistol. But together," she stopped, "together it is the shape of something that a pharmacologist will confirm and a determined inspector will eventually be able to prosecute if he is pointed in the correct direction. And Gerald Pargeter is an unpleasant man with a debt and a guilty conscience about a stepmother he was unkind to." Marple's voice was even, but beneath it something ran that was not quite anger and not quite sorrow, something that had no efficient name. "He did not hurt her. And he will not be charged for something he didn't do if I have anything to say about it." Dorothea went inside to telephone Margaret Holloway. Marple sat in the garden in the thin October sunlight, with the smell of cut stems around her and the apple tree dropping its fruit in 1s and 2s, and thought about a young man standing outside an unfinished house, and a woman who had been waiting for 26 years with perfectly steady hands, and whether patience, in sufficient quantity, becomes something else entirely. she thought it did. She thought it had. Dorothea's sitting room had, by Thursday morning, acquired the working atmosphere of a place where something serious is being assembled. The dining table held 3 sheets of paper arranged in a loose sequence. Marple's timeline, written in her small, precise hand, the kind of handwriting that has never been in a hurry because the mind behind it moves faster than the pen and can afford to wait. The timeline began in January. Olive Swan begins visiting Cecily Pargeter with increased frequency. Twice weekly, according to 3 separate village accounts, Marple had gathered through the careful, unhurried method of asking questions about other things in the vicinity of people who knew the answer to the question she actually wanted. February. Cecily mentions to Rowena Chalk, in passing, that she has been sleeping poorly. She attributes it to the cold and the short days. Rowena attributes it to grief. Edmund had been gone 4 years, but grief is not linear, as Rowena knows from her own experience of smaller losses. Neither of them considers a third explanation. March, first prescription delay. 10 days without cardiac medication. Routed through a mechanism that was technically procedural and practically effective to a regional processing centre. Called in on Cecily's behalf by Olive Swan. April. Dr. Marsh begins his extended medical leave. Dr. Hargreaves arrives. The practice's institutional memory of Cecily Pargeter, her baseline, her trajectory, her specific rhythms, resets to whatever the new file contains and whatever the locum observes fresh. May. Olive's visits increase to every other day. Village accounts confirm this, offered freely and warmly, as evidence of devoted friendship. The supplement is introduced around this time. Marple placed it here based on the date of Olive's handwritten note, which carried no year but referenced spring, and the particular supplement in question requires approximately 4 months of consistent administration to produce meaningful cardiac interference in a patient with a pre-existing arrhythmia. This was what Margaret Holloway had confirmed on the telephone the previous afternoon in the careful language of a retired professional who understands the weight of what she is being asked. The interaction was real. The timeline was medically coherent. The dosage required was available in standard commercial preparations. A district nurse of 30 years' experience would know this without having to look it up. June. Dr. Hargreaves examines Cecily for the first time. Notes fatigue, reduced appetite, increased cardiac irregularity. Consistent with known condition. Advises rest and monitoring. Does not alter medication. Does not look for external contributing factors because he has no reason to. The note in the file. The note in Olive's hand, recording sleep disturbance that Hargreaves had not observed and Cecily had not mentioned to him, had been added during the 8 minutes Olive spent alone in his office in July. Marple had confirmed the date through Mrs. Gedge at the surgery, who remembered the appointment because Cecily had seemed particularly tired that day, and Olive had been very attentive. July, 2nd prescription delay, same mechanism, 6 weeks before the death. August, Hargreaves's 2nd examination. Further deterioration, still within the parameters of what he expected, given her condition. The supplement by this point has been consistent for 3 months. The sleep disruption, managed through Olive's pattern of late visits and early morning deliveries, items left on the doorstep that required Cecily to rise early, small necessities that kept the rhythm of her rest fractured, has accumulated into the kind of chronic fatigue that wears the heart quietly, without drama. September 14th, a Tuesday. Olive arrives at Cecily's cottage. The death certificate says cardiac failure. It is not wrong. Marple sat back and looked at the timeline with the expression she wore when something was almost complete and the remaining distance required a different kind of attention. She had spent Tuesday afternoon pursuing Hargreaves. She was honest with herself about this. She had suspected for approximately 36 hours that the locum's professional cloud might be connected to something deliberate, that he had been recruited or manipulated or had agreed, under some pressure she hadn't yet identified, to provide inadequate oversight as part of a wider arrangement. She had been wrong. Hargreaves was exactly what he appeared to be. A tired doctor who had made a mistake in Bath that was never formally pursued, but that he could not stop pursuing internally, who had taken a quiet village locum because quiet was what he needed, and who had looked at Cecily Pargeter with genuine care and insufficient depth because he was a man running on diminished resources in a practice stripped of its institutional context. He was not guilty of anything except being depleted at the wrong moment in the wrong place. Marple had recognised this on Tuesday evening and set it aside without self-recrimination, because being wrong on the way to being right is not failure. It is the method. What she had taken from the Hargreaves detour usefully was the confirmation that the note in the file was the only external interference in the medical record. One note in one hand, inserted during 8 unobserved minutes. Everything else Olive had done existed outside the official record, in the domestic spaces that official records do not reach. Food brought to a neighbour, visits timed with care, a supplement recommended with apparent kindness. A phone call made on someone's behalf that went slightly, technically wrong. She telephoned the pharmacy in Winchester herself that morning, having obtained the number from PC Nunn through the mechanism of asking him for it directly and watching him decide, correctly, that assisting her was more productive than not. The pharmacist, a young man named Reeves, conscientious and slightly alarmed by the specificity of Marple's questions, confirmed the supplement interaction in terms that matched Margaret Holloway's assessment precisely. He also confirmed that the second prescription delay, combined with the supplement's effect on the medication's baseline efficacy, would have created a period of approximately 3 weeks, during which Cecily's cardiac protection was meaningfully reduced. 3 weeks ending the 14th of September. "Thank you," Marple said. "You've been very helpful." She set the phone down and looked at her timeline. Then she added one final entry at the bottom, in slightly heavier pen. The way you underline a thing when you want to remember that it is the point, and not merely a fact on the way to the point. The method was chosen because it could not be cleanly prosecuted. It was chosen by someone who understands medicine, who understands procedure, and who has had 26 years to think about it. She sat with that for a moment. Then she said to Dorothea, who had been reading in the armchair and pretending not to watch, "Tell me everything you know about the Renwick family. Not Olive. The family. Where they were from. What the civil case was actually about. Everything Cecily Holt did and didn't do in 1978. Dorothea lowered her book. "I don't know most of that, Jane." "No," Marple agreed, "but Rowena does." She looked at the timeline. "She's known since she found the letter in the Pargeter papers. She's been waiting to be asked the right way." Dorothea was quiet for a moment. Outside, the chalk stream ran, and the October light came through the window at its low autumn angle, and somewhere in the village Olive Swan was doing whatever Olive Swan did on a Thursday, steadily and without apparent concern. "What do you need from Rowena?" Dorothea said. "The name," Marple said, "and whether Cecily knew Olive had followed her here." She already suspected the answer to both, but suspicion, in her experience, was not the same as knowing, and knowing was what the next step required. Rowena Chalk was not surprised when Marple came to the library on Friday morning. She had the look of someone who has been expecting a particular conversation, and has spent the intervening time deciding how much of herself to bring to it. The library was empty at that hour. Nettlecroft's reading habits ran to afternoons, and Rowena had the particular stillness of a woman alone in a room full of books, which is its own kind of composure. She was at the main desk when Marple arrived, not reading, just sitting with her hands flat on the surface in front of her, as though steadying something beneath it. "I need to ask you about the Renwicks," Marple said without preamble, because Rowena was not a woman who benefited from approach. What the civil case was actually about. What Cecily Holt did. Rowena looked at her for a moment. Then she reached beneath the desk and produced a folder. "The one from the Pargeter papers, the legal correspondence, and set it between them. I copied it before Gerald could lock the papers away," she said. "I didn't know why at the time. I think I did know why." Marple opened the folder. The full picture assembled itself across 4 documents. The original solicitor's letter, a court summary from 1978, a private letter from Edmund Pargeter to a colleague, and a single handwritten page in a hand Marple had not seen before. Older, less controlled, the hand of someone writing under pressure. The civil case was a property matter. Harold Renwick. Olive's father, Thomas's father, had been in a long-running dispute with a development company over a piece of land in Gloucestershire that had been in the Renwick family for 2 generations. The case hinged on a boundary agreement made in 1961, the terms of which were disputed. A witness who had been present at the original agreement, who could have confirmed the Renwick position, was a young woman named Cecily Holt, then 23, employed as a secretary at the solicitor's firm that had drawn up the original document. Cecily had testified that she had no clear memory of the 1961 agreement's specific terms, that her recollection was incomplete, that she could not confirm what the Renwicks claimed she had witnessed. The court found against the Renwicks. The land was sold. Harold Renwick died the following year. His daughter always believed of a broken spirit, though the death certificate said heart failure, which Marple noted with a stillness she did not allow to show. The family was reduced. Thomas Renwick, 22 and newly accepted to an architecture program, withdrew his place because the fees were no longer manageable. He spent the next 30 years in the diminished life of someone who had been standing at the threshold of something and had the door closed by a stranger's convenient memory failure. Edmund Pargetter's letter to his colleague, written in 1981, 2 years after the case, said, in the careful language of a man processing something uncomfortable, "I have reason to believe Miss Holt's testimony was less complete than it might have been. I have decided, on reflection, that this is not a matter I am positioned to revisit. The case is concluded. I mention it only because it sits with me. Cecily had married Edmund 3 years after that letter was written." "She told him," Rowena said quietly. "At some point she told Edmund what she'd done, or hadn't done, and he married her anyway and kept it, and it sat with him, and she spent the rest of her life being generous to people in a village far enough from Gloucestershire that nobody knew." "Yes," Marple said, "and Olive knew all of it." "Olive's father lost his land and his health and his life," Marple said, "and her brother lost his future. And Olive spent 26 years living 30 miles from the woman responsible, watching, waiting for conditions that would allow her to act without being caught." She paused. "The question I needed answered is whether Cecily knew who Olive was, whether she understood what was happening to her." Rowena reached beneath the desk again. The envelope was cream, unsealed now. Rowena had opened it. Marple understood before this morning. Her name was not on it. No name was on it. It had been in a book Cecily had given Rowena 6 months before she died, with a note saying, "Keep this for me, and if anything happens, you'll know when to read it." "She knew," Rowena said. She passed the letter across. Marple read it. It was not a dramatic document. Cecily wrote the way she apparently lived. Carefully, with warmth that was also strategy, kindness that was also management of consequence. She wrote that she had recognized Olive Swan within the first month of Olive's arrival in Netleycroft. She wrote that she had said nothing because there was nothing to say. No crime had been committed, no law broken, and the thing she herself had done in 1978 was not something she could raise without raising herself. She wrote that she had watched Olive become a fixture in the village with the dread of someone observing whether they cannot stop. And then, in the final paragraph, she wrote, "I think she is doing something to me. I cannot prove it, and I cannot say it, because to say it is to explain why, and to explain why is to explain what I did. And I have spent 20 years becoming someone else, and I cannot bear to undo it. So I am writing this down and giving it to you, Rowena, because you deserve to know the truth about the woman you've been writing a history for. Her maiden name was Holt. She told a lie in a courtroom in 1978, and a family lost everything, and now the family has come to collect. Marple set the letter down. Outside the library window, the chalk stream caught the morning light and held it briefly. The way moving water holds light, incompletely, beautifully, for only a moment before it moves on. She knew, Marple said, and she chose not to speak. Yes, Rowena said, and in choosing not to speak, she made it possible. Neither of them said anything for a moment. The library held its breath around them, all those words on all those shelves, and none of them adequate. "The supplement note," Marple said finally. "You have it." Rowena opened the desk drawer and placed it on the counter between them. Olive's handwriting, upright, careful, the hand of someone who learned penmanship when it was still considered a moral quality, recommending a specific supplement for Cecily's fatigue, written with the apparent care of a devoted friend. Marple looked at it for a long moment. Then she looked at Rowena. "I need you to keep this," she said, "and the letter, and the copy of the civil case documents. Keep them somewhere Gerald Pargeter cannot reach, and Inspector Lorimer can." Rowena nodded. Once, with the gravity of someone accepting a weight they've already decided to carry, Marple walked back through the village in the October morning, past the chalk stream and the Norman church and the yew that was older than everything, and she thought about Cecily Pargeter, who had known and said nothing, and Olive Swan, who had waited and said nothing, and the 26 years of silence between them that had functioned, in the end, as a kind of agreement. She thought about Thomas Renwick's folded house plan found in a bedsit in Swindon. She thought about the photograph on the mantelpiece. The young man outside the unfinished house, smiling at someone who loved him. She was ready for the last conversation. Marple went on a Wednesday morning, alone. She had told Dorothea where she was going, because Dorothea deserved that, and she had told her not to follow, because Dorothea deserved that also. She had telephoned Inspector Lorimer the previous evening, and spoken to him for 11 minutes, in a tone she reserved for conversations that must be both precise and appear to be something other than precise. She had given him 3 things: the name Margaret Holloway, and the substance of the pharmacological confirmation, the prescription routing records that P.C. Nunn had now formally documented, and the existence of the note in Cecily's medical file, written in a hand that was not Hargreaves's. She had not told him about the letter, that she was keeping for the moment when it would do the most good, which was not yet. Lorimer had listened in the particular silence of an intelligent man recalibrating. When she finished, he said, "Miss Marple, how long have you known this?" "Known it with certainty," she said. "Since yesterday morning." "Suspected it with reasonable confidence." "Since I stood in the churchyard on the evening I arrived and watched a curtain move." Another silence. "Then I'll need everything documented." "Rowena Chalk has everything documented," Marple said. "She will be expecting your call." She had not mentioned she was going to Olive's cottage. This was deliberate, because Lorimer would have sent someone with her. And what needed to happen next could not happen with someone present. Not because Marple was in any danger. She had assessed this carefully and concluded that Olive Swan was not a woman who acted impulsively, had never acted impulsively in her life, and was not about to start on a Wednesday morning over tea. But because the conversation she needed to have required a specific quality of privacy, the kind that only exist between two people who both know exactly what they are to each other. The late rose at Olive's gate was past its best now, the petals loosening in the October air. Marple opened the gate with the worn latch and walked up the path and knocked. Olive answered promptly, as though she had been expecting the knock without knowing quite when it would come. She was dressed neatly, her grey eyes attentive and calm, and she looked at Marple for a moment with an expression that was almost, not quite, but almost, relief. "Miss Marple," she said, "come in." The sitting-room fire was lit. The carriage clock on the mantelpiece showed 10 past 10. The photograph of Thomas was in its place between the clock and the lavender, and neither of them looked at it, and both of them were aware of it. Tea was made and poured with the steady competence that Olive brought to everything. They sat in the chairs on either side of the fire, and for a few minutes the conversation ran along the surface of things. The weather, the village, the way the chalk stream was running higher after the weekend rain. Olive was a good conversationalist. She had always been a good conversationalist. It was one of the things that had made her effective. Then Marple set down her cup. "I want to tell you about a woman I once knew in St. Mary Mead," she said in the tone she used for these moments. Not the gentle old lady tone, but the quieter one. Beneath it, the one that meant she was speaking plainly and expected the same. Her name was Mrs. Partington. She spent 11 years as the most devoted carer for a bedridden mother-in-law who had, at one point some years before, done something that had very nearly ruined her. Olive held her cup and listened. Her hands were still. "Mrs. Partington did not harm her mother-in-law," Marple continued. "Not in any way the law could reach. She simply managed the conditions. She was present and competent and caring, and she arranged things very quietly over a long period of time, so that the old woman's decline followed its natural course in a particular direction rather than another." She paused. "When the mother-in-law died, Mrs. Partington had the composure of someone who has completed a long obligation. Not grief exactly, something underneath grief, the particular piece of a finished thing." The fire moved. The clock ticked. Outside, a bird crossed the garden without comment. "I noticed that quality in you at the Women's Institute sale," Marple said. "I noticed it before I knew anything else. It is a very specific quality, and I have only seen it twice in my life." Olive looked at the fire. Her expression had not changed. The composed, attentive expression of a woman who has spent a professional lifetime not allowing her face to do things without her permission. But something in the room had shifted, the way pressure shifts before weather. "I think," Olive said after a moment, "that you've come to the wrong conclusion, Miss Marple." Marple waited. "But I don't expect you have," Olive said. The quiet that followed was not uncomfortable. It was the quiet of two women who have both lived long enough to know that some silences contain more truth than the words arranged on either side of them. "Thomas?" Marple said gently. "Tell me about Thomas." And something changed in Olive Swan's face. Something that all the composure in the world, all the 30 years of district nursing, all the 26 years of waiting, had not entirely managed to reach. It was brief, a tide moving under ice. Then it was gone, and the composure returned, and Olive set down her cup with complete steadiness. "He drew houses," she said. "He could look at a piece of land and see what should stand on it. He had a gift, a real one, not the kind people are called gifted to be kind." Her voice was even and factual, and beneath it was an ocean. "He drew our father's land once, just for himself. What he would have built there. He kept the drawing." "I know," Marple said quietly. Olive looked at her. A long, assessing look, without hostility, with something more complicated than hostility. "She told someone." "She wrote it down," Marple said. "She knew. She knew what you were doing, and she knew why, and she chose not to speak, because speaking would have required explaining herself." She paused. "I don't think that decision surprised you." "No," Olive said. "It didn't." Something in the set of her shoulders, not a collapse, nothing so dramatic, but a degree of release, a fraction of weight redistributed. She was always very careful about herself. "Yes," Marple said, "she was." They sat for a moment in the warmth of the fire, two women in their 60s, in a well-kept cottage in a Hampshire village, with everything laid out between them and no efficient way to resolve it. "What happens now?" Olive said, not with fear. With the practical curiosity of a woman who has always needed to know the next step in order to prepare for it correctly. "Inspector Lorimer has the pharmacological evidence," Marple said. "The prescription records. The note in the medical file. He will have the civil case documents by this afternoon, and Cecily's letter by tomorrow morning." She looked at Olive steadily. "It is not a simple prosecution. Your method was chosen in part because it isn't. But it is enough, I think, for a determined inspector to pursue." Olive nodded slowly. The nod of a woman receiving information she has already at some level been prepared for. "I don't regret it," she said, not defiantly, simply as a statement of fact offered without expectation of absolution. "I know," Marple said. "Do you understand it?" Marple looked at the photograph on the mantelpiece. The young man outside the unfinished house, smiling at someone who loved him, not yet knowing. She looked at it for a long time. "Yes," she said finally, "I understand it. Understanding it is not the same as what must happen next." Olive looked at the fire. "No," she said. "I suppose it isn't." Marple rose and set down her cup and picked up her cardigan from the arm of the chair. At the door she paused. "The drawing," she said. "Thomas's drawing of your father's land. Do you still have it?" "Yes," Olive said. "Keep it," Marple said. "Whatever happens, keep it." She walked back through the October village, past the stream and the church and the yew, and behind her the cottage sat quiet and still in the morning light. The last rose at the gate, losing its petals one by one to the small autumn wind. Inspector Lorimer came to Dorothea's cottage on Thursday morning with the expression of a man who has spent the night revising his understanding of something he thought he understood, and has arrived at the revision with more professional grace than most would manage. He sat at Dorothea's kitchen table with a cup of tea he didn't drink and a notebook he barely opened, and he listened to Marple complete the account she had begun on the telephone 2 evenings before. She gave him everything in the order that would be most useful, not the order she had discovered it, which was the order of a mind working, but the order a prosecution would need, which is a different architecture entirely. The prescription records first, establishing mechanism and access. The pharmacological confirmation from Margaret Holloway and the Winchester pharmacist, establishing medical coherence. The note in Hargreaves's file, establishing presence and opportunity. The supplement note in Rowena's possession, establishing sustained intent. The civil case documents, establishing motive with a specificity that 26 years had not diminished. And finally, Cecily's letter, which Dorothea had collected from Rowena the previous afternoon, and which now sat in a plain envelope on the kitchen table between them. Lorimer read the letter twice. He set it down. He looked at the window, where the October garden was doing its quiet autumnal work, the apple tree nearly bare now, the last fruit on the ground. "Gerald Parger," he said, "has a verifiable alibi for the 48 hours preceding Mrs. Pargeter's death," Marple said. "A client dinner in Winchester. The restaurant will have a booking. The client will confirm. He is not a good man in several respects, Inspector, but he did not harm his stepmother, and I think you already suspected as much when you looked at the timeline carefully enough." Lorimer was quiet for a moment. The alibi hadn't been fully verified, he said, with the particular flatness of a man making an admission that costs him something. "No," Marple agreed, without emphasis. "It will be verified today." He looked at the letter again. "And Mrs. Swan, you spoke with her yesterday morning." "I did. She didn't confess. She said she didn't expect I had come to the wrong conclusion," Marple said, "which is not the same as a confession, but is also not nothing. And she made no attempt to explain the note in the medical file, the prescription routing, or her connection to the Renwick family." She paused. "She is not a woman who wastes words on things she considers beside the point." Lorimer picked up his notebook, then set it down again. "This will be a difficult prosecution," he said. "The method was chosen precisely because it would be," Marple said. "Yes, she is an intelligent woman, and she had considerable time to plan. The pharmacological evidence is real, and the expert confirmation is solid, but the mechanism relies on cumulative effect rather than single deliberate act, and any competent defense will work that territory thoroughly." She folded her hands in her lap. "I am not telling you it will be simple. I am telling you it is true." Lorimer looked at her with the expression she had seen on other inspectors' faces over the years. That specific mixture of reluctant respect and mild frustration that comes from being handed a correct answer by someone who was not supposed to be looking for it. "You've done this before," he said. "Once or twice," Marple said pleasantly. He left at 11 with the letter, the supplement note, and a list of names and numbers written in Marple's small, precise hand. He paused at the door. "Miss Marple, if you find yourself in Winchester, I shall come and say hello," she said. "Do verify Gerald Pargeter's alibi today, Inspector. The man is unpleasant enough without the additional burden of being incorrectly suspected of murder. The door closed. Dorothea let out a breath she had apparently been holding since breakfast. Rowena Chalk came at noon and sat in the kitchen with cold tea, and the particular stillness of someone who has handed over something heavy and is not yet sure what they weigh without it. She had spoken to Lorimer by telephone that morning. She had confirmed everything. She had answered every question with the careful precision of a librarian and a woman who understands that accuracy, in this moment, is the only form of loyalty still available to Cecily Pargeter. "The history," she said after a while. "I'm not going to finish it." "No," Marple said. "I didn't think you would. It wasn't really about the mills in the end." Rowena looked at the table. It was Cecily trying to build something that would last. A record of herself as someone who belonged somewhere. Someone with deep roots and a clean history. She was quiet. She'd spent 20 years building that, and she knew it was sitting on sand. And she kept building anyway, because what else do you do? Marple said nothing because nothing was the right response. "Was she a good person?" Rowena asked. Not rhetorically, with the genuine uncertainty of someone who has lost their answer to a question they thought was settled. "She became a kinder person than she had been," Marple said carefully. "Whether that is the same thing is a question I am not equipped to answer with any confidence. I'm not sure anyone is." Rowena nodded slowly. She left at 12:30, walking back through the village with the straight-backed purposefulness of a woman who has things to return to. Books to catalogue, a library to open, a life that is hers and not anyone else's story. Marple's train was at 2:00. She sat in Dorothea's garden for the hour before departure, in the wooden chair under the apple tree, with a cup of tea cooling beside her and the October sun making its best effort at warmth through the thinning canopy. The garden smelled of leaf mould and the last of the cut stems and the faint sweetness of the fallen apples going back into the ground. She thought about Cecily Pargeter, who had told a partial truth in a courtroom in 1978, and spent the rest of her life being generous because generosity was the only architecture available to her for a redemption she could not directly seek. Who had known at the end what was happening, and had chosen silence because the alternative required her to become, again, the woman she had spent 20 years ceasing to be. She thought about Olive Swan, who had waited with a patience that had become, over 26 years, indistinguishable from her character, who had sat with the dying and brought soup to the bereaved and baked sponges for the grieving, and conducted, beneath all of it, the long, quiet, medically precise undoing of the woman who had undone her family, who had said without defiance and without apology, "I don't regret it." She thought about Thomas Renwick's folded drawing of a house on a piece of land that had been taken from his family by a young woman's convenient memory failure, found in a bedsit in Swindon, and kept by his sister in a coat pocket through every year of waiting. She thought about justice, what it was and what it wasn't, where it lived and where it failed to live, and whether the gap between those two locations was a flaw in the system or simply the shape of human situations, which do not resolve into clean lines because they were never made of clean lines to begin with. The law would take it from here. Lorimer was intelligent and now correctly directed, and the evidence, while not simple, was real. Whether the prosecution succeeded, whether 12 people in a courtroom could be brought to understand what a retired district nurse had done over 8 months, with a supplement and a prescription delay and a pattern of visits, that was no longer Marple's to determine. It had never been hers to determine. What was hers was this: a man who had not murdered his stepmother would not be charged with murdering his stepmother. The truth of what had happened would be spoken aloud in rooms where it needed to be spoken. The letter Cecily had written, her final careful, incomplete act of honesty, would be read by people who could do something with it. Thomas Renwick's drawing would remain in his sister's keeping, wherever that keeping now led. The chalk stream ran beyond the garden wall. She could hear it, that constant, even sound of water that has no opinion about any of what has happened along its banks, and will continue long after everyone involved has become the kind of history that nobody writes down. Dorothea came out with the carpet bag. "Car's ready," she said, and then stood for a moment looking at the garden with the expression of someone who has let something go and is noting, with some surprise, that the world has continued. Marple rose from the chair with the unhurried care of her years and picked up her cup and looked at the apple tree once more, bare nearly to the last, patient, already preparing underground for what came next. "Thea," she said, "you did the right thing writing to me." Dorothea looked at her old friend for a long moment. "Did it turn out right?" she asked. Not the answer she already knew, but the harder question beneath it. The one about whether right and just are always the same geography. Marple considered this with the seriousness it deserved. "It turned out true," she said. "That's what we had to work with." They walked through the cottage and out to the car, and the garden settled behind them into its October quiet, and the stream ran on, and the yew in the churchyard stood as it had always stood, older than the questions, patient as stone, keeping nothing, releasing nothing, simply there. The 2:15 to Winchester left on time.